So I'd like suggest to start. So Colin, this is your turn. Please speak.
Okay. Well, let me just say this very general point. Since I retired 7 years ago, I've been writing essays, and I know that many of you have read some of them in my book, Philosophical Provocations. And so the essays are all short, varying from, well, sometimes they're as short as 1 page, but they're usually about 4 pages. And so you will know that I write them in a way where I don't allude very much to literature that's out there, even when it's relevant. I just talk directly about whatever it is I want to talk about, and try to keep it as brief as possible. And although I would agree that some of the essays are quite difficult, I try to keep the prose very straightforward and intelligible. And, I hope you will agree with me that I've always done that throughout my career. So the essays that we're going to talk about today are like that. Sometimes people find it confusing because they expect me to be discussing, what this or that person has said about the subject. And usually I don't bother to do that. It's not that I'm not aware of the discussions that have gone on. I just don't do a lot of references and clog up the text with unnecessary commentary about the literature and so on. So I'm always hoping that my readers, such as you, have a good knowledge of the subject. I'm assuming that you have a knowledge of the subject. And so I don't need to explain things, and I'm just going to get straight to the point. But sometimes that does create problems because people sometimes don't have the knowledge that I'm assuming that they have, or they don't agree with the things I think they should agree with. So I presuppose a lot, and I just get to the point. All right, so that's a general observation I would make. So let me talk about these 2 essays that Anton actually selected. He could have selected any of 300 of that. I didn't tell him to take these. He just decided to do them. I reread them myself. I reread them on Wednesday, and as I said to him yesterday, for me it was like reading them for the first time because I don't remember these 300 essays I've written over a 7-year period. I sometimes will start reading them thinking, I don't remember how this ends. And I was actually disappointed with the one about mental privacy because I was hoping and expecting that I would give the answer. And I realized I got to the end of it, I didn't give the answer. I said there was no answer that I could think of. So anyway, I reread them again this morning just to refresh my memory of them. So it's quite possible for me not to remember everything in the essays even now. So you may have to remind me. So let's talk about I'll talk the first one about materialism. There are many arguments against materialism that people have given. And those arguments are not generally regarded as conclusive by proponents of materialism. So Kripke's argument, Jackson's knowledge argument, Nagel's subjectivity argument, it's not as if people just, when those were published, other philosophers who were materialists bowed down before the argument and said, oh yes, you're absolutely right. They find ways to respond to it. I mean, in philosophy, I would say generally in philosophy, you don't find arguments that are just going to knock down a very established old position like materialism. It doesn't happen. What you find is you have hopefully a new argument which gives a fresh perspective, adds to what already is there. So somebody trying to come to a view of the subject can find themselves moved in one direction or another. So, I wouldn't claim that the argument that I give in that short paper, that it proves that materialism is false. I can think of ways somebody might try to defend it against the argument I gave. The argument I gave is meant to be a challenge to a materialist to explain something which seems to be, on the face of it, inconsistent with materialism. So the argument I give, and I don't believe that it's an argument that's been given before, although it seems to me it should have been, because it's fairly obvious. We all know the classic knowledge argument, which people attribute to Jackson, although, Bertrand Russell initially gave this argument, which is I can know everything about your brain, and that knowledge doesn't give me knowledge of your mind, your consciousness. Okay, we're familiar with that. So therefore, the conclusion is your consciousness is not reducible to your brain. Well, the argument I give is a knowledge argument in that way, but it's a different one. And it says that if materialism says, as it does, that the nature of a mental state, conscious state, that is to say, by nature I mean what the mental state is constitutively, what it is, what it's identical with, what it's nothing more than, is a state of the brain. And the state of the brain that people usually have in mind is a neural state. So they know enough about the brain to know that in the brain there are neurons, which are a type of cell. Those neurons have a certain histology, structure. And then there's a physiology associated with those cells, and people know a good deal about that. So in the classic philosophical example, in the brain, when you're in pain, there's something called C fiber firing. Okay, and if you know enough about brain science, you know what that means. It means it's a certain type of fiber attached to a nucleus of a neuron, and there are electrical impulses that go down those fibers and connect with other neurons via synapses and blah, blah. I studied all this when I was a psychologist, so I do know about the brain. So the materialist is claiming that a mental state, like a pain, is nothing more than those physiological processes that I just described. Okay? All right, that's what the view is. We have to be very clear what it is, because we mustn't take the view to be weaker than it really is. It's not the claim, obviously, that there's a correlation between mental states and brain states. That's not the claim. The claim is there is nothing more to mental states than brain states. So the argument that I give, the challenge, is to say, well, if that's the nature of a conscious state, when I know my own conscious state, and not just know that I'm in it, but I know what kind of state it is. So when I know that I'm in pain, I know that I'm in pain, and also I know what pain is. Well, if pain is, according to materialism, those neural firings that I mentioned, why is it that I don't know that those neural firings are occurring? Why is it that I don't know that that's what pain is, if that's what it is? Okay, on the face of it, you would think, well, if that's what it is, and it's nothing more than that, well, when I know what pain is, don't I know what pain is? And if pain is those neural firings, then I should know that. But I don't know that. Okay, I don't know it. Nobody has ever claimed that I do. I don't know that pain is neural firing by knowing what it is. Okay, so that's the knowledge argument, that I ought to be knowing more about my brain and the neurological nature of my mind than I do know if materialism is true. So a dualist obviously will say about this, well, this proves my point that the mind is not the brain, because that's why you can't know about your brain just by knowing your own mental states, because they're not the same thing. So I contrast this with, so it's a startling, interesting claim that the materialist is making, not one that in common sense we would say, well, that's just what I thought, because when I experience my own mental states, they seem to me like brain states. They don't seem to you like brain states. They seem like the opposite of brain states. And yet, according to materialists, they are brain states. So this position, materialist position, is usually called central state materialism. It contrasts with behaviorism and functionalism, because in the case of those theories, you do know the behavioral and functional properties of your mental states, and that's the nature of those states according to those doctrines. So, we all know quite well that if we're in pain, we have a disposition to withdraw our body from the painful stimulus. That's not a piece of knowledge that no ordinary person has. Everybody knows that about their pains. Similarly, in the case of functionalism, everybody knows that pain is something that you don't desire. You don't want to be in pain. That's a part of the functional nature of pain. It interacts with desire in a certain way, also with belief and so forth. So those things are perfectly available to our ordinary knowledge of our minds. And they're, in that way, they're quite intuitive, because you say, oh, the behaviorist is telling me there's nothing more to my mind than these dispositions to behavior. Well, I do know that there are these dispositions to behavior. I know they're very closely associated with it. So I see why that might be true, similarly with the functionalist position. But in the case of central state materialism, that's not the case. Nobody says, oh, yes, I thoroughly suspected that was so. And so you've confirmed my common sense conviction that my mind is identical to my brain. Okay, so so the question then is for the materialist is to explain why why it is that we don't know the nature of our mental states if the nature of the mental states is as the materialist says it is. Why is that? Okay, so somebody might say in reply to that, well, isn't it just like the ordinary case of knowing what water is or what heat is? You know, in that case, I don't know that water is H2O as part of my common sense belief. And same way, I don't know that pain is C5 firing according to my common sense belief, but that's what water is. So why couldn't pain be that way too? That's the parallel that's always given to the case of the psychophysical case. The trouble with that point, there are actually 2 points about it. One I make, and the other one which is familiar, which I don't make because my policy is not to make points in these papers that have already been made. My point about that is, yes, but in the case of the water and the heat, there we already believe on good grounds that these are physical things. We're materialists about water and about heat. We're not dualists about water. We don't think they're immaterial things. We think that hot things have got some physical property or other. We don't know what it is, but we're pretty sure it's material. But that's not what we think about our mental states. We don't think that our mental states are material. We're just wondering, well, which material state are they? That's why materialism is a surprising, startling, and interesting thesis, because it goes against what we normally would suppose, or supplements it to a very large degree. So there's not a symmetry between the two cases. So there's still an explanation. So we haven't got an explanation of why there's this knowledge gap, which appears somewhat paradoxical. The point that I didn't make, but others have made, is you can't say about this, but isn't it that there's an appearance of pain, which where the appearance is not the same thing as the reality of pain. So the reality of pain is C5 firing. Then it appears to us painfully in a certain way. And so that's the way it appears. And all we know about the pain is its appearance. But the reality of the pain is C5 firing. Isn't it just like the case of water? We know the appearance of water in common sense and by perception, but we don't know its chemical nature. Okay, now, so the analogy is restored. This is familiar from Kripke's discussion of this. And the point Kripke makes, and Nagel has made this, it's a point endlessly made. Yes, but the appearance of pain is also a mental entity, a mental something. So the materialist is claiming that the appearance of pain is also physical, right? Is also a neural state. So then the question just arises again. Well, but then why is it when I know the appearance of my pains, I don't know the states of my brain that constitute those appearances? There's no gap, you see. There's no logical gap there's physical gap between the states of my brain that constitute the appearances of pain and appearances of pain. So the problem just arises again, so you don't get out of it that way. So the common sense objection to materialism holds, which is, simply to repeat what I said, we should be knowing more about our brain than we do by knowing about our own mental states, given that materialism is true, but we don't know that. So it looks like this is an argument against materialism. Okay, I've just repeated the argument, which I think you probably already know quite well from reading that paper. Okay, now I should probably then go to the next one quickly, and then I won't take so long over that maybe, and then we can get to the discussion. So the second one is about this very, I think, common set, kind of old point, almost embarrassing to make, but occurs to everybody who thinks about these problems before they get into the philosophical literature on it, which is you can't see somebody else's consciousness. Right? That's why there's a skeptical problem about inverted spectra and so forth. You can't look at somebody, you can't look in their eyes and see whether they're seeing red rather than green. Right? It's not possible to do that. You can't look at a person who's asleep and see what they're dreaming. Nor can you look at their brain while they're asleep and see what they're dreaming. You might think, oh, well, if we got closer to the actual basis of dreaming, because no doubt something's going on in the brain that correlates with the dreaming, maybe we could then see the dreaming. But everybody can see on quite brief reflection that is not so. You can't solve the problem of other minds by looking at people's brains. So it looks as if the mind, consciousness in particular, is imperceptible. The senses cannot reach out and reveal the mental states of other people. On the other hand, an equally obvious point, we all know our own mental states remarkably well. Okay, we have introspective knowledge of those mental states. Now, I don't want to go into the question of the nature of introspection in this paper. I didn't go into it. I tried to sidestep issues, but there are different theories about introspection. You know, there's the kind of perceptual theory according to which we have an inner sense, and it literally does perceive our mental states. Another theory is the higher order thought theory, you know, that we just have a belief about our mental states, but we don't actually perceive them. I use the word perceive in the paper in a rather non-theoretical sense, which really just means we have non-inferential awareness of them. Now, whether I'm going to call that sensory is going to depend on what you're going to mean by a sense and what's a sensory representation. But I want to make the contrast between what we know by inference and what we know by immediate apprehension. So the simple word for that, traditional word for that, is perception. So I perceive my mental states. And I don't make heavy weather of the use of the word perceive. I simply mean you've got direct non-inferential awareness of them. So on the one hand, my mental states are not perceptible by you at all in any way, but they're very perceptible by me. Okay? So the question is, why is that the case? It seems like an unusual state of affairs. Nothing else in nature is like that. So the question is how to explain it. So people regularly make this point, and some people deny it, you know, in various ways, but people make the point. But they don't ask the question, which I do, of, well, what's the explanation of this strange fact of imperceptibility? Now, let me just quickly say, if there's any Wittgensteinians among you, I'm not discussing the question that Wittgenstein brought up of whether I can see that somebody is in pain by observing their behavior. Right, there is that view. You know, Wittgenstein had, McDowell has this view, and too. You can look at somebody writhing in agony, and you literally see that they're in pain. Okay, I'm not disputing that. I'm not discussing that point. The point I'm discussing is, suppose they're not writhing in agony, they're not behaving that way, then you can't see their pain then. And no Wittgensteinian has ever said that you could. Right? There's no behavioral sign of it. Well, so you can't see it otherwise than through person's behavior, if we take Wittgenstein's line. So I'm discussing, the best example for me is the case of somebody asleep. There's all sorts of things going through their consciousness. They're not behaving in any way that could give us any indication of what those things are. But there isn't any way we can look at them under a microscope or with a brain scanner and see their mental states. So all right, so that's the question. So I discussed various possible ways to answer this question. I focus on the question biologically, which I actually think is a very good general approach to philosophy of mind questions, and because I think it often sharpens the question quite well. So in this case, the way I approach it is, well, you know, organisms evolve through the normal mechanisms, and they seem to have evolved two very different characteristics. One kind are public physical characteristics of the body, other are mental characteristics, which are private in the sense I just described. Well, why would evolution do that? How does it do it, and why would it do it? It's not that, as I say, it's not that there's a great evolutionary advantage to privacy of one's mind. Sometimes it can be not an advantage, because then you have to convey it to somebody else rather than just they can see it directly. I also make the point that it doesn't seem like it's a metaphysical necessity that mental states are not perceptible by others, because can't we imagine a possible world in which the aliens' brains are hooked up to each other's brains in such a way that they do get sensory impressions of the other person's mental state, just like ordinary sensory impressions. So we would say that they perceive them. But in our case, our senses don't do that. So the point then is, I go through various other things, and the obvious things like, well, it's not that our minds are transparent, so they're like, you can't see glass when it's transparent. That's not the reason you can't see them, obviously. It's not that our minds are too small to see. That's one reason things can be invisible. It's not that there's something in front of our minds that prevents us seeing it, occlusion. None of those things is the case. So none of the obvious explanations seem to apply to this case. It seems from an evolutionary point of view, it's highly anomalous that there should be this privacy, and it's very hard to understand what its basis might be. So, to put it in the language that I'm known for using, it's a mystery why our minds are invisible or not perceptible, and because no sense will apply to them. It's a mysterious thing. It seems to me that it's true, but it's not something we have any explanation of. So it would be one way to approach the problem of consciousness would be to try to explain why minds are imperceptible. One would expect that would shed light on the nature of consciousness. But as I say, as far as I can see, that's a mystery. Okay, that's it for my intro.
Okay, thank you very much, Colin. Who wants to start? Who wants to raise the hands up? So at the moment, I didn't see any hands raising up, so I can a chance to start by myself.
Okay.
If people don't mind. I have a question about your idea of metaphysical contingency, about privacy of the mental. And my question is about this scenario with aliens or Martians who are somehow connected to each other and able to see each other mental states. So in this case, my question is how do I know that these Martians, they are different individuals? So on my point of view, if they have full access to other minds, there is no difference at all.
Yeah,
but if they have like tiny access or some access, but not full access, so still there is some privacy. So to be a distinct individual, distinct conscious individual, you should have some privacy. And for me, it seems like a good objection against metaphysical contingency of privacy of the mental. What would you say?
Yes. Well, I like the point you're making because it's true that if I were to say other beings have got exactly the same access to my mind that I've got to my mind, that would seem to suggest that those beings would have to be me. But of course, in my thought experiment, it's not that they've got exactly the same access to my mind that I have. What they've got is they can see my mind on certain occasions, not on all occasions. Most of the time, they won't see what's in my mind, right? So they don't see every property of my mind at a given time, as we might think that I have that kind of access. They can look at me at a certain time, and let's suppose they've got eyelids on their eyes. Their eyelids are down; they don't see anything of my mind at all. And then they open up those eyelids, and then they see what I'm at that moment experiencing visually. All right. Then I don't think there's any tendency then to believe that they must be me. We'd have to suppose that their perceptual access to me is somewhat selective. So it's not that whenever they turn their organs towards me and my mind, everything about my mind at that moment is then perceived by them. Right? All my sensations, visual, auditory, tactile, all of them. We might suppose that they can select certain of them. They can choose. It's as if suppose that they do it visually. Their visual system would have an instruction like this: reveal to me his visual states at the moment, but not his auditory states or his tactile states. Or reveal to me now how things smell to him. So then the others perceive directly how things smell to me, but not how things look to me. So that would be the case. That would give you what I need for the thought experiment, that people have got direct perception of each other's mental states, but without the danger that they become identical with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just make a further point. Well, I won't make the further point yet, because you might want to say something in reply to what I just said. I think it's pretty. I think what I said is correct.
Yeah. So I just need to think of your words. Thank you very much. So Dmitry, go ahead.
Let me add on a point though that I was about to make. Tom Nagel read that paper of mine, and he said, well, he didn't have any trouble being convinced of that because he thought telepathy was metaphysically possible.
Okay.
Then we had a discussion about what telepathy is, and I said, that's not what I'm talking about. Telepathy just means I know directly what's in your mind. It doesn't mean I perceive your mind. Right? Mm-hmm. So it's close. It's a similar kind of thing, telepathy, and you can see why he would say it's logically, though it's not actually the case, it's logically possible. But I was saying something a bit more strange than that, which I think somebody might certainly reasonably question, as to whether the idea that somebody might have a visual impression of another being's visual impression. That's not easy for us to understand what that would mean, right? I see your seeing of red. It seems funny to say that. But so I can certainly imagine somebody would question that metaphysical possibility. Often that's the case with metaphysical possibilities. They seem on the surface of them to be clear cases, but then sometimes they're not as clear as you might think. You can say these words, I see your seeing of things, but if you ask yourself, do I really understand what possible state of affairs I'm describing? Well, it can be difficult. So there's an avenue there to wonder about it. It doesn't give an answer to the question I raised in the paper, because it raises the question, well, why is that so? And that no good answer. There seems to be something logical going on in it. I mean, it seems as if my consciousness is such that necessarily there's no such thing as somebody seeing it in the same sense in which I can see a cup that's in front of me that's white, And anyway, okay, next point.
Okay, Dmitry, please go ahead.
Yeah, Colin, thank you very much for these papers. They're indeed very provocative. So, speaking about the first one, the argument against materialism. So, you're questioning why aren't we have knowledge of the neuronal basis of our mental states. And I was trying to imagine how would that, what would that be? And how would this work biologically? So imagine I had a pain in my arm, and then I would see somehow that's the firing of my C fibers in the brain.
Yeah.
How would then I understand, how would then it would be related to my hand? I mean, wouldn't that be confusing biologically to see the pain in the brain rather than to feel it in the arm?
Well, it might be confusing, but possible, right? Unless you wanted to get an evolutionary argument going that evolution would never evolve something confusing. But let's focus on because you're homing on a very good point here. I want to just focus on it too. So the idea I talk about in the paper is there's nothing objectionable in the thought that I could have introspective knowledge of my brain states. Right. So what does that mean? It means that something is occurring in my brain, physical, not psychological, and I know what that is by this immediate awareness, not by inference. Because of course I can easily know when I'm in pain that my C fibers are firing, because I know that C fibers are correlated with pain, so I infer it. So all you need to get introspection, you need this idea of non-inferential awareness. So the idea would be something happens in my brain, and my brain is wired up in such a way that will lead to my introspective ability, my introspective faculty, and I will then be immediately aware that my C fibers are firing. So I've got two kinds of awareness going on, that I'm in pain and that my C fibers are firing, right? And that seems metaphysically possible, and that should be so. Then the point of raising this in the context of my paper is if that were the case with us, we would be much more receptive to the materialist position, and this argument that I'm giving in the paper wouldn't really apply because we would know about it. All right, so we'd say, if a materialist comes, suppose that's the way our brains are arranged. The materialist comes along and says, "Oh, I've got a theory for you. Actually, when you're aware of your C fibers firing at the same time as being aware of your pain, there's a reason for that. That's because the pain is the C fibers firing." Now, you might resist that theory still. You might say, well, I don't think that pain could be the same as C fibers. After all, I know just what C fibers are, and I know what pain is, and they're not the same kind of thing. And then a Nagel argument or a Kripke argument or a Jackson argument could be applied to that. But at least the materialist could say, the materialist would not face the objection, well, but you're suggesting something which is completely paradoxical, given that we know nothing about our brain. The materialist will say, well, look, given my theory, doesn't that predict that you will be aware of something in your brain when you are aware of your pains? And you are aware of something in your brain. Well, here's a nice explanation of that. That's because your pain is your brain state. So it's okay. The objection is dealt with. So that was the point of that, of thinking about that question. But it's certainly a reasonable question to ask me. What would it be like to have this kind of awareness of one's own brain? And there are ways you can approach it, because we don't have that at all, and it's very alien to us to have that. It's not that we can immediately say, "Oh yeah, I see. That's very familiar to me." Let me give you an analogy. We have, in addition to our regular five senses, we also have the sense which is usually called proprioception, meaning awareness of one's own body, right? Like bodily position, bodily movement. Now those seem like physical facts, bodily position, but they're awareness of myself from the inside. Okay. So it seems, you might say, I know by my own inner awareness that thing called proprioception, that my limbs are arranged in a certain way. Well, that's what it would be like to know about my own brain. It would be rather like that. There are facts about my brain, and they're hooked up to my other parts of my brain in such a way that I know facts about my brain when those facts obtain. So it does seem like it's a possibility. You can make sense of it. It seems strange, but it seems you can make sense of it. So it wouldn't be a good answer to my objection to say, but it's totally inconceivable that anybody could ever know facts about their brain. So that's why we can explain why, even though materialism is true, you don't know facts about your brain by knowing facts about your mind. Okay? I mean, that's in the dialectic of this argument, somebody could say that. But it seems to me that's a rather weak reply to the argument. I mean, the argument itself is like most of these arguments, is extremely simple. It doesn't require complicated dialectical maneuvers, If the nature of the pain is the brain state, and you know the nature of your own pain because you have the pain, why don't you know that the pain is a C fiber firing? So it sounds like a very reasonable question that the materialists ought to be able to answer. And there's an attempt to try to deal with it. And those analogies I mentioned always play a key role in this. Oh, it's just like the case of heat and water, There's an appearance of the thing, then there's the reality of the thing. We've discovered that heat is molecular motion, and water is H2O, and we've discovered that pain is C fiber firing, and they're exactly the same. Well, the point that was Kripke made, and then Nagel made, and others too, is, well, they're not exactly the same. They're crucially different. That's why the objection that I'm raising in my paper applies, because you can't get out of the objection by making this point. The argument is just very similar to the classic knowledge argument, isn't it? If materialism were true, then if I know everything about my brain, shouldn't I know everything about my mind? There's no more to my mind than my brain, so shouldn't that be the case? And there are fancy ways of trying to respond to that too. But my argument is just, well, if I know about my pain, I know what my pain is, and my pain is C fiber firing, I ought to know about my brain by having pain, but I don't. So how can we explain it? Or always in these arguments, you've got a range of positions that you're trying to choose from, trying to find reasons to favor one position rather than another. So the dualist, you see, is the opponent in this. The dualist is saying to the materialist, I've got a better theory of this than you've got. And in this case, the dualist will say, this point is a good argument in favor of my position, because I explain very clearly why you can't know what's in your brain by knowing what's in your mind. They're completely different things. So, of course, that's the case, right? So there's a connection between that and the other paper, of course, because the dualist will also say, I discussed this in the paper, well, I can explain why mental states are invisible. They're not material. They're immaterial, and immaterial things are not perceptible. Now, I say in the paper that's not a very good argument, because it's not at all clear. There are two problems with it. One is it's not clear that everything immaterial is necessarily imperceptible. What about ghosts? Right? Are they necessarily imperceptible? It's not at all clear why those two concepts are incompatible. But the other point, of course, is, well, that's a terrible argument, because if you couldn't perceive, if the reason you can't perceive your mental states is they're immaterial, that you shouldn't be able to introspect them either, which is a form of perceptual awareness, but you can. So that's not a very good argument. So that's the way the dialectic works in these cases. You're considering different positions, and you've got to consider how one position can deal with various facts better than other positions. You remember in Kripke's discussion of the mind-body problem, when he gives his modal argument, he also presents it as an explanation argument. How can the materialists explain the fact that it seems to us metaphysically possible to have pain in a possible world without C fibers, and C fibers in a possible world without pain? How does the materialist explain that the fact that it seems to us that that's logically possible, metaphysically possible? And Kripke says, well, maybe the materialist can come up with something, but he needs to come up with something. This is a problem he needs to answer. He can't just say, oh, I think they're the same. He has to deal with this. So I'm saying this is something materialist needs to answer, and it's not obvious to me how it's going to be answered. Okay? The materialist then can come up with various maneuvers, and we can consider them, and then we get off on what philosophy is. Right? These complicated arguments about things in which we often lose sight of the basic intuitive point that gets the whole thing started, you see. All right. Anyway, next question.
Okay. So now Vadim, then Artem, and then Evgeny and Andrew.
Thank you very much, Professor McGinn. I have a few remarks and questions, both of your essays, but start with...
We're getting some problems with audio.
With remark about your first essay, maybe other people ask you their question. If I understand you correctly, in this first essay, you claim that it is impossible to know something by senses, including introspection, without knowing about its nature of
yes.
this something.
Yes.
With this, I can object using an analogy with words and their nature. I think it would be better than the analogy with water and heat you just mentioned. So,
okay.
Let's assume that if a nature of words is to refer to things, with this thesis many would agree, I believe, then knowing the words presupposes knowing the reference. But it seems to be wrong. I can know words without knowing the reference. Moreover, I can know words without knowing the words at all. That is, without knowing they refer at all. I think you would agree that it is possible to know words without knowing that they are words that they refer. But to refer is the essence of words. So, if this is right, so it's possible to know something without knowing its nature. And then, if in case of mental states, so even if the nature of mental states must be physical, material, I still might know mental states without knowing their physical nature or even being aware of such a nature. That's a subjection.
I see what you're saying. It reminds me of a position that OBrien Law used to have. His position was, our knowledge of our own mind is like demonstrative knowledge, where we just say pain here, and we don't know the nature of pain at all. We just perceive, but as you say, we can perceive something, see something, and not know its nature. So in the case of words, yes, well, you're thinking, well, I hear the words that are being uttered, and I don't know the nature of those words, right?
Yes.
I'm not clear what I think of that. I mean, you have no knowledge of the nature, and yet you're hearing a word. Do you hear it? Do you hear it as a word, or you think it might just be part of a noise made by a natural object? You know, then it's not so clear you're not hearing it as a word. But your general point seems to be right. You can let's take this. I mean, I don't know if I just use the same example, but let me put it abstractly without giving an example. I can see something I've never seen before and have no idea what it is. And somebody says to me, what is that? I say, I've got no idea. I can see it, but I see it. Now, you can say that, it sounds reasonable. Can you have no knowledge of its nature when you see it? Well, you are going to see you will be aware of its appearance, so that's part of its nature. You'll not be aware of its hidden, what Locke would call its real essence, right? The hidden nature, but you'll be aware of something about it. So it's not so clear, I think, to get something which is... So putting the question of these analogies is always difficult, but the thing with the pain cases is not, this is what I would say to OBrien Law, it's not that your knowledge of it is purely schematic or demonstrative. You do know what pain is. Right? You know what pain is. In fact, I would say you know the essence of pain. The essence of pain is a certain feeling that it has. Right? So you do know that. You know you're not in the position of somebody just glancing at something from a distance and not knowing what it is. You've had pains many times. You know exactly what pains are. You've had them over and over again. In the case of pains, you do know fully the nature of what a pain is, and you know all of its various aspects through introspection. The materialist says that every one of those aspects that you know when you know the nature of pain is a material property of the brain. So everything you know about pain, the nature of that is given by something in the brain, so you should know those facts about the brain that constitute the things about pain that you know by immediate awareness. It's not that your knowledge of pain is just like the case I described, where you've no idea what you're referring to. You just say that, in this very non-descriptive way. And I don't know what that is, you say about something, and you've got no idea what it is. You don't know whether it's an animal, whether it's a piece of rock. You don't know anything. Material, immaterial. You just see that, and you don't know what it is. That's not your relationship to pain or seeing red or, all the rest of it. You know a lot about that. In fact, you might even find to say, you know everything about pain that's essential to it, the way it feels. The dualist, you see, will say, well, there were these correlates to pain, C5 That's not the nature of pain. That's irrelevant to it. That's completely extrinsic to the nature of pain. You know that perfectly well. So I don't think it's possible to get out of the argument by suggesting that it might be a case like somebody referring to or seeing an object or kind of object which they don't know anything about at all. Right? That would be, if you could apply that analogy to the case of the pains, you'd have an answer to my objection, because it would be, well, no knowledge of the nature of the thing we're referring to is possessed by us by introspection anyway. Nothing. We know nothing about pain. We just call it that, which is the OBrien Law position. We just call it that. But that seems wrong. We know a lot about it. So all those things we know about it are physical states according to the materialists, and yet we don't know about those physical states. So the argument is okay.
Thank
Vadim,
you.
is that convincing? Vadim, is that okay?
Yes, totally convinced.
I like your point. Again, you're all raising very good points which have to be looked at when you're considering these types of arguments. All these objections are genuine points have to be gone into. If I were writing an orthodox philosophy paper, which I was trying to publish in a journal, I would have to go into all of these points. But I
Thank
don't.
you.
I'm trying. I was trying not to go into all these points when I was writing these things, just because otherwise you can't write as much, because you have to go into every possible. But they're all good points to go into. We all have to. All these possible avenues where there's a weakness, we have to go through them, and okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, Artem, your turn.
Thank you, Colin, for this really inspiring papers, and I have questions to both of the papers.
Okay.
The first is related to what Vadim asked. It is again about the nature and the perception of the nature or essence of something.
Yeah.
You introduced this example with ghost, assuming that ghost is something immaterial, right? So consider this. In one case, I really see a ghost, and in another case, I see only a hologram, and they are indistinguishable. So I see exactly the same thing. What about the perception of this visual image or this thing? What exactly about my perception of this makes me to know that ghost is something immaterial and hologram is something physical or material? You use these terms indistinguishably.
Yeah. Well, we wouldn't know that just on the basis of our ordinary perception. They would look, as you say, indistinguishable.
Mm-hmm.
I think we would not know that we were seeing a ghost rather than a hologram.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't know what the difference is between them. The point that I made about the ghost, of course, is that there's no logical incompatibility between being an immaterial thing, whatever that means. There are questions in all of this about what's meant by material and therefore what's meant by immaterial. Again, I didn't discuss them. One of you may raise the point, which I think would be a very good point to raise. I would raise this point myself if I was in the audience. You keep using these words material and immaterial. What does it mean? This is a Chomsky point. Again, it's familiar point, so I don't discuss it. But we don't know what those things mean. But let's suppose somebody believes in ghosts and there are ghosts. Let's suppose that's true. And every night they see a real ghost in their house, and they, there it is again. But then a clever scientist comes along and puts a hologram in place of a real ghost. And the person thinks they're seeing a ghost again, the same ghost again. They're not. They did. So the perception doesn't reveal the nature of the perceived stimulus as to whether it's immaterial or a physical hologram. It doesn't. But that doesn't mean it doesn't reveal anything about the nature of it. The case you raise is just like the case, say, of water and XYZ. Two different things physically, which look exactly the same. So we can't tell, we don't know from our perception of water that it's H2O as opposed to XYZ. People on Twin Earth looking at XYZ, they can't distinguish on that basis from water. So there are properties, and there is the nature to the things which are not revealed in perception. But there are properties which are revealed in perception. That's the point. Mm-hmm. They are revealed.
But
all the superficial properties are revealed, you see.
But you say our ordinary knowledge of water and heat already represents them as material phenomena of some sort. What do you mean by ordinary knowledge then?
Ordinary knowledge means the knowledge a person has who perceives them, talks about them, but doesn't know any chemistry. The knowledge somebody had before chemistry ever investigated water. Just like when Putnam talks about before we ever found out that water is H2O, there was an ordinary conception we had of water. How it looks, how it tastes, how it feels, that's the ordinary knowledge of it. So I'm saying that our ordinary knowledge of water as a perceived substance, a liquid that we drink and bathe in and so forth, tells us it's a physical phenomenon. Right? Nobody thinks, oh, well, I don't know whether water is material or immaterial. Everybody knows it's material. They just don't know what material it is exactly. Okay? So nobody's surprised. If somebody came along and said, I'm a materialist, and I'm going to tell you something really interesting now. Water is a physical thing. you say, that's interesting. I mean, of course it's a physical thing. I knew that, just as I think that this cup is a physical thing. I don't know its atomic structure, but I sure as hell know it's a physical thing, right? So the difference with the mind, you see, is I don't think on the basis of my ordinary acquaintance with my mind that it's a physical thing. That's why materialism is an interesting and startling doctrine. If anything, I think it's an immaterial thing. And the materialist is saying, well, you think on the basis of your awareness of your mind that it's an immaterial thing, but let me tell you, it's a material thing. And then he gives the arguments for that. Okay. That's why it's different, you see, in the two cases.
Well, can I ask a question on privacy, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is a really interesting paper, because this is a common point that privacy is a characteristic of mind, but you say you write about God, and it is clear that in the history of philosophy, many people believe that our mental states are not exclusively private. They are private only among us, or human beings, but there is a person who have access to others' mental states. This is really something revealing.
Yes.
And I want to return to the topic that Anton started with his first question. Look, you connect privacy to introspection. So then we can ask, how do I know that that some mental state is private, right? And as far as I understand your reasoning, that it would be incorrect, illegitimate to say that I know this from some third-person evidence. That somebody tell me is that I don't know what do you feel right now, for example, right? So I know this introspectively, but consider such a situation. Consider that I do introspectively know, or I do perceptually know someone else mental state.
Mm-hmm.
And Berkeley has a nice example. He says in the three dialogues that God knows what pain is, but he doesn't suffer pain.
Okay.
So I know what your pain is. It means that I say have the same qualia, but I do not have any behavioral reactions to that. So I do not cry and so on. But then, how can I know that this is not my state? How can I know that this is a state of someone else? So why it can?
You're saying, how can I know that it's a state of someone else if I perceive it?
Right.
If I perceive it. So you could raise another question, which is, how do I know that other people's mental states are not my mental states?
It's the same. Yes.
But that's a good question. That's a deep question. How do I know that these mental states are mine, and I know that those mental states pointing at you are not mine but his? How do I know who has the mental states that exist? I don't know the answer to that. It seems to be a good question. But what I don't think is that the claim that you could perceive somebody else's mental states makes that question any easier or more difficult or anything. In other words, it's not that if I perceive other people's mental states, I have an even harder problem of explaining how do I know that they're not mine.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I would know that they're yours, not mine, if I perceive them is I see them over there where you are. I look at you and I see over there where you are roughly that there are some mental states and that they belong to you. Just like when I see you physically, I see over there's a person who's got spectacles on and so forth and so on. So perception would seem to give you a bit of a better basis for saying well, these are not mine because whatever mental states I have are over here with me. All of this is puzzling philosophically, right? What it means. How do I know these mental states are mine? It actually goes back to the cogito. Among the papers I've written, there were quite several of them on the cogito. There are many puzzling questions about the cogito, and Descartes never answers the question, well, I know that I've got various thoughts, but we don't ask the question, how do I know those thoughts are mine? The skeptic would say, well, you know that there are various thoughts, and you know that you exist, but isn't there a further question, that those are your thoughts? And Descartes, you haven't explained to me why, how you know that they're your thoughts. And that's a deep question, how you know that. But I don't think it's an objection to what I was discussing with the perception point. I mean, let's go back to God. I mean, it is a very, as you, I think, rightly said, it's a very familiar idea that although other human beings can't know what's in my mind, I believe that God can know what's in my mind directly. It doesn't seem as if that's a philosophical confusion to say that. I mean, it presupposes that there's a God and God has certain powers, but it doesn't seem like a logical contradiction to say that. It seems perfectly possible. And that's why I say it's a metaphysical contingency that we don't see, that others don't see our minds. There could be many, aliens could be godlike and have the ability to see into our minds. That certainly could be the case. So privacy is not something which is a necessary truth. And given it's not a necessary truth, of course, then it calls for an explanation as to why it holds contingently. And that's what I'm saying. It's very hard to come up with anything to explain it. But it seems like a very robust intuition that it exists and privacy is a real phenomenon. The thing I've tried to get across actually in other papers I've written on this is that in the early 20th century, when behaviorism came along and other doctrines like that, they rightly perceived that if you think that the mind is, as traditionally understood, a private realm, that completely removes psychology from the natural sciences. It makes the mind completely different from every other natural phenomenon in the world, biological, physical, chemical, and so on. And so they thought, well, we better not hold that doctrine then. We better not believe in privacy, because how can we make a science of psychology if the mental is an inherently private thing? They thought it couldn't be observed. No third-person observation, you see. It goes back to the introspectionist school in psychology. Psychology is about me introspecting my mind. So they abandoned it. But they were right to say that, as soon as you accept that the mind is private in this very strong kind of sense, you're really already admitting that there can't be a science of it that belongs with, can be unified with the other natural sciences, because it's about something completely different. That's why I make a point of saying that you can't get out of this by pointing to invisible things in the physical world, as people often have done. Because it's not that the mind is too small to be seen like atoms, and it's not that the mind is like dark matter. In dark matter we can't perceive dark matter, that's why it's called dark. But it's not that the mind is made of dark matter as opposed to light matter. That's not right either. So we can't find an analog or a precedent for the invisibility of the mind in any physical natural science. So it seems to be a very, very peculiar fact. It biologically makes no sense at all, just from the point of view of evolutionary theory. Why on earth would the genes produce this hidden private phenomenon? It seems completely bizarre. So there are very good philosophical reasons, scientific reasons, to question the privacy point. And given that it can't be explained, as I argue in this, those reasons become all very pressing. So then the question then becomes a very stark opposition between somebody who says privacy is an inescapable fact about consciousness. It just is a fact. And if that means that you can't be a science of consciousness and it can't be integrated with the rest of science, so be it. And the other side says, that's intolerable. We can't have that. So we have to dispute that consciousness is private. Otherwise, we can never have a unified view of the natural world. These are deep questions. They're hard questions. So my paper is indirectly about those questions. And of course, I just raise what seemed to me when I wrote it a rather obvious question. Well, let's agree that the mind is private. Why? And no obvious explanation presents itself.
Okay. So next, Evgeny.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Colin, for this wonderful essay and the opportunity to discuss them with you. So I want to ask two questions about the privacy issues. So my first initial question, unfortunately, was exactly like Anton's. So my actual first question is that I get when I hear you answering. So am I right that the claim that privacy is metaphysically connected, necessarily metaphysical connected with the mind, the claim you denied in your paper and now is compatible with your final claim about the mystery of consciousness and so on? Is this two claims compatible according to your opinion?
You have to explain to me why you think they're not compatible, because I don't immediately see why you would say they're not compatible.
Because it's your weighing to your your way to argue, your weighing an argument to your final point starts with claiming about metaphysical necessity, and then you deny that. Then you say that it's metaphysical contingent, and you end with the mystery.
All right, I think I understand it. So what you're wondering about is, how can I say that there's a mystery about the explanation of privacy, while also claiming to know that privacy is metaphysically contingent? So I'm claiming to know something, it's metaphysically contingent, and then at the same time saying, I don't know the explanation of it. So I'm now saying I know it and I don't know it, right? Is that the point you're raising?
Yes.
Good. Okay. But aren't these questions about two different things? I'm not claiming it's a mystery whether or not privacy is metaphysically contingent or necessary. I'm saying I know the answer to that. It's not metaphysically necessary. What I'm saying is something I don't know the answer to and is a mystery, is the explanation for why mental states are private for us, why we can't perceive them. We don't know why. I'm saying that, as far as I can see, it would be possible for another being to perceive them, God or aliens, and I sketch out what that would amount to. So I claim I know that's metaphysically possible. But if I ask the question, given that, well, then why is it that we can't perceive them? Given that it's metaphysically possible, why can't we perceive them with our senses? Well, I don't know the answer to that. That's a mystery.
Okay, thank you. It's become clear to me. May I ask a second question?
Yes.
So, in your reasoning, you presuppose that we can perceive our mental states. And that sounds right. But what do you think about illusionism? The claim that we can't perceive the content of our mind because that content is an empty one, and we just grasp the propositions that we are, for example, in pain, and think wrongly that we also feel that we are in pain.
Is there a person that you want to attach this illusionism to, a philosopher that holds it? Or you're just describing a possible position?
A possible position.
But I think there are some philosophers who've said this recent years.
Yes.
I'm thinking of one in the University of Maryland, who's Carruthers, I think. Mm-hmm. Are you thinking of Carruthers?
I'm not thinking about Carruthers. I'm thinking about Kit Frankish, for example. But
all right. Okay. Well, I think my answer is going to be a little bit disappointingly obvious. But I think that's a preposterous idea. That is so. It's also Dennett has a view like this. It seems to us that there's a phenomenology, but there isn't a phenomenology. That's the Dennett position. So Dennett will say there are no qualia, but it seems to us that there are qualia. Now, a reply that's been made to that by Galen Strawson and other people is, but seeming is itself a qualia. So that's a contradictory position to say that. How can it seem to you that there's a phenomenology and there's no phenomenology? Because seeming is a phenomenology. Okay, that's one point that can be made. It's an okay point. I mean, an ad hominem point. But I would just, I'm a bit more of a Cartesian about this. I don't think it makes sense to suppose that I firmly believe that I'm in pain. I know what pain is, but I don't have any pains. Or I firmly believe that I have thoughts, but I have no thoughts. I'm a Cartesian. I think if you believe
that sounds
things,
for you like
so
this is a contradiction for you.
Well, contradiction is a formal notion. It's a metaphysical impossibility. I'd rather say that. It's not conceptually possible. I actually do have another paper which I attack this question. In fact, a few papers, which I'd love to discuss with you on another occasion, actually, if we were to pick them, of skepticism in application to introspective knowledge. Let me just digress a moment on it, because I think it's interesting. The skepticism, I believe that skepticism is a very strong position, which is very hard to refute. So I think that skepticism about the external world or the past or the future is very difficult to refute. But it seems to most people that there's one area in which skepticism has got no chance of success, and that is knowledge of our own minds. See, no skeptic has ever been able to give a brain in a vat kind of example with our own minds. That would be to reply to what you just said to me. That would be a case in which I might be, I now think I'm a being with mental states because it seems to me that I have them. But might I not be a brain in a vat who has all these thoughts that I have mental states, but I don't have any mental states? Mm-hmm. Isn't that a logical possibility? The skeptic says, right? So that would mean, for instance, here I am, and I firmly believe that I'm in agony from hitting my toe against something. I did actually get my toes crushed recently, and I was in agony. So I'm thinking of that example. And yet, I'm not in pain. I think any reasonable person thinks that's absurd. Of course you're in pain. It hurts like hell. Right? What more would it need to be in pain than to be? So you can't distinguish seeming to be in pain from being in pain. So for somebody who thinks skepticism is convincing, this is a very strange fact, that skepticism applies to everything except knowledge of your own mind, it seems. And then you can give arguments why. I mean, an argument that you can give is, but surely the basic thing behind skepticism is you can distinguish between a belief and the fact that the belief is about. And once you've got that distinction, you can always say, well, then how do you really know when you have a belief about a fact that fact is the case? Okay? But that argument applies to introspective knowledge. I believe that I'm in pain. That's one fact, the belief. Then there's the fact that I'm in pain. That's a different fact. So how can it be that belief, that different fact, the belief one, logically guarantees that the other fact obtains? That seems somewhat strange and paradoxical. Maybe it's the case, right? So I'm explaining now this other paper of mine. But then what I go on to discuss is this question: do I know infallibly in that way that the pain I'm having now? Do I know the time of the pain? Or is skepticism applicable potentially to my knowledge of the time of the pain? So could it be there's an epistemic possibility that I had a pain 2 minutes ago and I believe I'm having it now, falsely? But it actually happened. I did have it. So I get my toe crushed and I'm in agony. And I know for sure that I have a pain. And I think that I'm having the pain right now. Is it possible, though, that the pain actually occurred sometime in the past, not now? Now, I claim that you can make sense of that, and I go into elaborate thought experiments to prove it. But I think you can see when you think about that, that sounds like it's a lot more possible than just that the idea that I could believe I'm in pain and I just don't have any pain at all. But I could be wrong about when. So that is, from the point of view of the theory of skepticism, that's an interesting result, because it tells you that skepticism actually does apply to introspective knowledge in this one area, the time of the thing that's happening. It's not that there's one area where the skeptic can make no headway at all. Right? There is an area. I mean, I'll give you a sense of how that argument's meant to go, the thought experiment. Surely it takes a finite amount of time for the neural signals that correspond to my pain, the one that was in my foot that day, to reach the part of my brain where I form beliefs about my pains. Right? It takes a non-zero amount of time for that to happen. Well, couldn't somebody's brain be a lot slower than mine? So the pain, the stimulus occurs, the toe gets crushed at a certain time. The pain occurs roughly that time, a little bit later, because it takes some time for the neural signals to come from the injured toe to the brain. And then it takes some time for, let's say, 2 seconds for the neural signals to go from the pain center of the brain to the other part of the brain where I believe that I'm in pain. I judge that I'm in pain. That takes 2 seconds. So maybe the skeptic says, you think you're having the pain now, but actually you had it 2 seconds ago. It just took 2 seconds for the signal to reach one part of your brain to the other. Anyway, I'm digressing into that subject. As always, these things are never as easy as they seem. But I don't. Let me return to your question. No, I don't think the idea of the illusionist Dennett type view or Carruthers type view has any plausibility. And the arguments that are given for it are always terrible. And I try not to discuss terrible arguments in what I write, because you just waste everybody's time by discussing them. So,
yeah, thank you. Very convincing.
Good.
Okay. So
let me just say a little quick observation about what you just said, Eugenie. It's very nice when you're having a philosophical discussion, and you give a reply to their question, and somebody says to you, as you just did, I find that convincing. Nobody ever says that. It's like it's a point of pride with people. They are not going to agree that you've convinced them that you've answered their question. I've seen it, especially in America. American men, philosophers, they think that somehow or other when they ask questions of a speaker, I've seen this many times, that the audience asks a question. Normally the speaker knows more about the subject than the person in the audience, and the person listens patiently to their objection, and they give a completely convincing reply to it. And you turn to the question and you're thinking, hoping he's going to say, thank you, you replied to my question. Oh no, he's not going to be able to say that. So I want to encourage people to do what Eugenie just did and say, so. If you do feel convinced, say, yeah, I find that a convincing reply. Or, yeah, I want to think about it more, or, whatever. I think it's good. It's healthy to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So next, Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Colin, for your essays. They are very thought-provocative, as for me, as always, as all your papers. But I'm still find myself among the group that is not convincing with your argument.
I also like you're saying that. It's also good. I like that too. Say when you're not convinced too. It's good. Carry on.
I have a lot of questions, but I will concentrate on the big question about your argument against materialism. Here, I will try to restate the line of argument that Vadim Vasiliev and Artem have already posed. So as far as I understand, materialists can say that one of your main assumptions is that by perception or by sense, we can grasp the nature of the thing we perceive. But, they can say, it is not true, because we can be totally wrong about the nature of what we perceive. And there are a lot of examples. An example of Vadim Vasiliev was with words. The essence of word is reference, but we can perceive words without reference. My example was with vitalism, a well-known philosophical idea that living things have some different nature from non-living things, etc. We can perceive some something that is living, but we can be wrong about its nature. And if we can be wrong about the nature of what we perceive, that is the first point, then materialists can make a step further to the second point, that in your case, you are wrong when you claim about the nature of your pain. And the problem here can be with the transparency of mind or consciousness that some theorists arise, like Alex Byrne and Kretzky and so on, that in perception of some inner mental state, we cannot perceive the mentality itself. We can see a tree, we can perceive a tree, but we cannot perceive the perception of the tree. We can feel pain, but we cannot feel the feeling itself. And so if you really cannot directly perceive the mentality, materialists can say that, well, it is just because there is no such kind of thing as mentality, as mental nature. What you perceive is material objects. And what do you think, could such kind of argument be valid against your position?
Well, I think we're going to circle back to the same kind of point I made before. The difference is, of course, we can all agree that when you perceive something, you don't thereby acquire knowledge of its complete nature. That's we can all agree with that. Often when you perceive things, you don't know very much about the thing that you're perceiving. You have to discover it. Sometimes it takes a very long time. Let's take a nice example just to change the examples. I look up at the sky at night and I see all these bright spots in the sky. I'm seeing stars. Apparently people did not know they were seeing stars. They didn't know what stars were. They knew nothing about the nature of stars. And yet they're seeing them. Right? True. You can. So somebody might say, well, that's what it's like with our own minds. When we have these sensations, we see these things in us. We introspect these things in us, but we don't know their nature. That's something we discover. The neurophysiologists can discover their nature. Nothing wrong with that so far, right? That's okay. The difference is in the case of, let's go back to the case of the behaviorism and the functionalism. You see, that's the important point of the contrast between those two cases and the materialism case. In the case, take behaviorism. So I know that my pain has got various behavioral dispositions associated with it. Do I know every behavioral fact about my pain just by having pain? No. There's lots of things, behavioral facts about my pain that I don't know, that might be discovered, right? Empirically might be discovered. The thing with the materialist position is there's nothing that I know about my pain that represents it to me as in any way as the materialist says it is. So let's take a concrete example. Spatial position. If I perceive something, at least I know its spatial position, roughly. The stars are like that. I know that this star is to the left of that star. I know the moon looks bigger than, the other stars. I know that it's far away. I don't know how far away, but I know it's far away. So I know I'm not going to be surprised when I'm told that the stars are physical things in space. So I say, oh, okay, that makes sense to me. They look like physical things in space. I don't know what those things are, but they look like that. Do I, in knowing what my sensations are, know that they are physical things in space? No. I don't have any knowledge of where they are in space and that they are in space at all. Let me put it in another way. Suppose that the neural correlate of pain is at a certain place in the brain, a precise location in the brain. So it's located in physical space at a certain point. Does it look to me, does it feel to me as if it's located in space at some point? I just don't know the exact point? No. So that's why I say in the paper, nothing in my ordinary awareness of pain anticipates the truth of the materialist doctrine. So suppose somebody came along with the stars and said, well, you're looking up at the stars, we don't know what they are, but I tell you what I believe, whatever they are, they're material things. Now, of course, there's the question, what's meant by material things, which I said earlier is a real question in this. But let's suppose it means located in space. That's one thing you might mean by material. So the person says, I don't know what they are. They could be, and then you go through the range of theories that people used to hold, about the stars. But whatever they are, they're physical things in the sense that they are things in space. Okay? That's not what you say about your state of mind. Just as Descartes said, we do not understand our own minds as extended things in space. So nothing in our ordinary awareness of our mental state or in our common sense tells us that they are things in space which are extended, which is what physical means. Okay, now, of course, if we knew that about them, that would fall short of where they are in space exactly and which kind of extended substance they are, that they're neurons and all the rest of it. You wouldn't know that from it. But what you don't have in the mental case is that preliminary, commonsensical anticipation of the truth of the materialist doctrine. On the face of it. Now, a materialist, you see, might say, well, if you put it like that, I'm going to say that we do know that. I think we do think that our mental states are located in a certain way. They might say, I think we all think our mental states are located around here, where I am, where my body is, something like that. So in that sense of materialist, I'm a materialist. I'm claiming that piece of common sense is correct. They are physical things located in space around here. I can't tell you where, that's for empirical science to discover, but they are. But that, I take it, is not a plausible thing to say. Right? And that's what the issue is going to be. Right? That's what the issue will become. Is it possible to find? Or, you see, the other thing is to say, well, the case of materialism is an exception to this general rule that we generally, if materialism is true about something, it's generally the case that we understand that the thing in question is a material thing, something in space that's extended. But in the case of materialism about the mind, that's not the case. There, we're completely wrong. We think it's unextended. Descartes was completely wrong to say the mind not extended, not in space. It turns out that it is, and that's going to be the debate.
The clarification question, why would it be wrong to say that I feel pain in space exactly in my feet, for example?
Well, this point has been discussed, and it's an interesting point about why we experience our pain as in space, because we don't experience our other mental phenomena as in space. Well, bodily sensations, not just pain. Tickles, we feel tickles, but we don't experience our thoughts or our visual sensations as in space in the same way. The point, of course, that's always been made about this is it's not literally true that my pain is in my foot. If my pain is in anything, it's in my brain. But that's where, because of course without the brain there's no pain in the foot, but the brain, yet the brain centers where the pain is generated. There is a kind of illusion about the location of the pain in this kind of case. It really, if it's anywhere, it's in the brain, and then we project it into the foot. Okay. I mean, it would be, I mean, it's an interesting, suppose a materialist this is giving me a good idea. Suppose a materialist said, I've got a great new argument for materialism. When you feel a pain, it's always located in your body. So it must be a physical thing, because it's located in space. If it's located in space, it must be extended. They might even say, don't I feel the pain over 2 toes in my foot? So it's extended, it's in my foot. So it's a physical thing. If physical means an extended substance in space. Yeah, it's an interesting argument, We'd have to look at it and see what we thought. I mean, at this point, I do need to say something about these words material and immaterial, because I feel very guilty using those terms at all, because I don't think they make sense, you see. Actually, I think for the purposes of the papers I wrote about this, you can make sense of them. But if you're trying to erect a doctrine called materialism or immaterialism, you've got definitional problems. I don't know how familiar you all are with Chomsky's many, many decades of objection to materialism. The point he's made, and I think it's a convincing point, Hempel also made the same kind of point. There's no definition of physical that makes any sense that we have, or material. Any notion that made any sense, was at all clear, was exploded in the 17th and 18th century when Newton invented action at a distance, because that's not physical. The physical was defined by Descartes, in terms of extended substance in space. That was, and mechanism, right? What was called mechanism. That was a well-defined notion, but once that was abandoned, there's no well-defined notion. So physics as it now exists today, there's no notion of the physical which applies to everything in physics. So when we're trying to ask, when I said to you, the materialist may argue like this, there's a pain in my foot, and what I mean by material is being extended in space, so therefore the pain in my foot is physical. You feel you think, well, that's a crappy argument, that's no good. You don't know why, but you think, oh, I'm not convinced by that. The reason you're not convinced by it is you don't like that definition of the physical. And it's true, it's not a very good definition. It lets far too many things in. Right? So then you're struggling to find a definition which is intuitively a bit more restrictive. And that's when you run into problems. I mean, the most plausible attempted definition is the spatial one, of the material is the spatial one. But it doesn't work in the end. It doesn't work. So there's always a problem about, in these discussions about using these terms. When I'm using the words mental and physical in the context of this argument, I mean by physical brain states. And by brain states, I mean brain states of the kind described in contemporary neurophysiology. Because there may be many brain states discovered by future neurophysiologists, which are not like the ones we know about now. So what I'm stipulating I mean by material or physical when I'm discussing these questions is what is true of the brain as now understood by neurophysiologists. And so I mean specifically neurons, axons, dendrites, neurotransmitters, dopamine. I'm not using any notion of the physical that goes beyond that because I don't believe it makes sense.
Well, okay. Thank you very much, Colin.
Okay, my pleasure.
Okay, thank you very much, Colin.
Yeah.
So, Alex, go ahead.
Yes, I'll try to ask something. At first, I'd like to express my gratefulness to Professor McGinn. Your ideas had a great influence on me. I can identify myself as Mysterianist to some degree, and I'm honored to talk with you directly. So now, consider the privacy of mind. I don't think that I have some particular objection, but rather I have some intuition. So my intuition is that there is no something special with the privacy of mind, because it is just the consequence or result of the very nature of mind.
Yeah.
It seems to me that we can take consciousness as some kind of closed system. At least it was evolved as some kind of closed system. Computer software is an example of an artificial closed system. We can say that software is private to other subjects, as well as biological consciousness is private to other subjects. It is occurring inside the computer, and only the software itself knows what is going on with it. Of course, we can connect some display to computer hardware and see some visual interpretation of process, which is what is going on inside it. And we can make some things with a living brain, but I think that it is hardly possible to perceive some mental states immediately. What could you say about it?
Yes, I mean, you're raising a very interesting question, of course, particularly in the light of the analogy that's often drawn between the mind and software. That's a common way to think about things. And somebody might see in that the possibility of an easy explanation for the invisibility of the mind. Well, the mind is software, and software is invisible. So that's why it's invisible. There's nothing, they may say, nothing terribly mysterious or difficult about that. I mean, it would be slightly better than the argument that says, well, we can't see numbers either. And is that a problem? Okay. Well, in that case, the response would be, well, the mind is not the same thing it's not abstract like numbers. So it's an empirical phenomenon with causal powers. So that doesn't really work as an analogy. And then the other point, of course, is, well, there's no analogy, there's no analog of introspection of numbers, which does give you. Right? Now, in the case of software, we would need the idea that the computer is immediately, or is or could be immediately aware of its own software. That's a difficult idea. And I'd say it's not the case. I think we might say prima facie, the software is not perceivable by anybody outside the computer itself. Okay, that on the face of it, that sounds true. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But what we wouldn't have is the other side of the puzzle. See, as I say in the paper, the problem really isn't in the invisibility of consciousness. It's its invisibility plus its internal visibility, introspective. That's the puzzling thing. Lots of things are invisible for all sorts of reasons. That's okay. What's puzzling is the mind is both things is what's so strange. So we would need to supply the analog of introspection to the case of the computer's knowledge of its own software. And that is not, we don't have that. Now, the other question about software, this goes into slightly bigger issues, but there are different theories about the ontological status of software, as I'm sure you know. And Searle has long argued for a position which I think is correct, ultimately, which is that the software is a derivative form of intentionality. Computers don't have software considered in themselves, intrinsically, as he would say. They have it because they're interpreted that way by computer engineers and us who use computers. So really, that's a projected property that the thing has, which goes back to minds. So we're just back with the question about minds, you see. Why is it not visible? We don't really get beyond it. Here's another case that's interesting to consider. You might say, if I hear somebody else's speech, I hear the phonetic properties of what they say. I don't hear their meaning. So I don't sense or perceive other people's meaning. So isn't that similar to consciousness? So there are two things I don't perceive. I don't perceive consciousness. I don't perceive meaning. But there again, you see, it's a bit like the software case. It's a plausible idea that the meaning that words have is derivative from the meanings that speakers give those words, and those are mental attributes of speakers, and so that's just another case of the mind not being visible. That would have to be considered too. You know, would it be possible to make meanings visible? What would that be? Are they really invisible? You know, because there's something to be said for the idea that you can actually hear what somebody else means. It doesn't sound as bad as saying you can hear what their thoughts are. That sounds a lot more difficult. Anyway, these are all good questions to be thought about.
A few things.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, Sasha, you have, please.
Yeah, thank you, Colin, for this wonderful presentation and wonderful discussion. It is very interesting.
Thank you.
And, well, I don't want to argue against the metaphysical possibility of this kind of skills we can possess, like reading other minds or introspect our physical states that correlate with mental states.
Okay.
Well, but I guess I can imagine a possible world where I can do both of those skills. So I can introspect other minds, and I can introspect my own physical states. And as you claim, I can also introspect my mental states as well. And well, I really doubt that this kind of possibility is biologically plausible. I mean, well, it's going to be like a mind explosion or something like that, because I have to possess this kind of selective capabilities that can make me able to pay attention also specific kind of states that I want to attend first, or I want to read others' mind, or I want to know about my physical states. And I really doubt that this is going to be really evolutionarily plausible and necessary for human beings. Yeah. And I wanted to ask, why do you think that it's really possible to have these abilities? Thank you.
Again, it's a good question. I like it because I like to ask biological questions about philosophical issues. I think they can be quite illuminating. So I think what you're suggesting is, I say it's metaphysically possible for there to be beings, not human beings perhaps, but some beings very different from us, maybe more godlike than us, who've got a whole range of capacities that we don't have. So for instance, not only do they introspect their own minds, they also introspect their own brains, and they also perceive other people's minds, right? Maybe they can also perceive other people's brains, right? All this stuff, right? A lot more than what we've got, right? Now, what would we say about those minds? Well, it would be a very interesting question if we came across minds like that on another planet. How did they come to exist? And how do they manage to exist given what they've got? They would seem to be extremely informationally overloaded.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Very, very overloaded. And given the realities of evolution on Earth, we know that evolution never overloads organisms beyond what makes sense from a survival point of view. And that's a very restrictive condition. All sorts of logically possible creatures could never evolve on Earth because there are very strong constraints on what can be so. So you might say, look, in the light of all of that, don't we have a biological explanation of the invisibility of other people's consciousness? Sure, it could have been that there are possible worlds where organisms can see other people's consciousness, but human beings, as they've evolved, and other animals on Earth, they're not going to have that ability because it would require such a huge change in their brain capabilities, that it's just not biologically feasible. And then the point would be, it's not necessary biologically to know that. Why would it be necessary for you to perceive your mental states rather than just know them by inference? So the genes have got this question to ask: shall I design a brain in this organism which enables it to perceive the minds of other organisms, A, or B, shall I design one that can use general inferential reasoning processes to go from evidence to conclusions to figure out what's in other people's minds? Well, I've already got the latter. They have to be able to reason. Why would I build in this sense which gives me perceptual access to other people's minds? It would be very difficult to engineer it. It would be maybe impossible to get the physics straight, and it would be not necessary for survival reasons. So that's why, right? So then that position would say, so there's a really easy answer to this. Sure, it's metaphysically possible. There's no problem with that. It's not an intrinsic aspect of consciousness that it can't be perceived, but that's going against something which feels right, so we've got that. But it's biologically not feasible to have that, because it just would be too complicated and require too much, and evolution is very economical about everything. It doesn't do it. That would be one line to take. It would be interesting. I think one thing, it's very startling if that were true. It's just a biological contingency. It just happens to be the case that it would be too much. The question now can be raised about that. Here's one question. Okay, why does evolution give us the ability to know our own minds? Isn't that kind of redundant too? Isn't that requiring a lot of us to be able to introspect our own mental states? What's the point of that? Most animals don't introspect their own mental states. They've got mental states, but they don't. What's the point of it, right? So we have to answer that question. Why we've got that ability too. Also, there's the question, I hint at this somewhere in the paper, I think it's in a footnote. All sorts of knowledge that humans have goes way beyond evolutionary requirements. Right? Why do we know physics, philosophy? Why do we produce literature? There's all sorts of things that we do that don't make much sense biologically, and yet we can do them. So, why not? Another point would be, wouldn't it be quite useful to know other people, to perceive other people's states of mind? Biologically, it could be quite useful. You'd know what they're going to do more easily. I mentioned the case of communication. You wouldn't need to evolve language, and that's quite complicated. You could just see other people's thoughts in their mind and you'd know it straight away. all interesting questions that could be pursued. I can imagine somebody writing a PhD thesis on this very subject. Is it possible to give a biological explanation of mental privacy? Right? It would be interesting to go into it. Now, notice the point that, so far as I know, nobody's ever considered these questions, because they never considered the question that motivates my essay. What's the explanation of mental privacy? Right? And sometimes it's very good to ask a question which generates new avenues of research, and thought about things. And I would like it, actually. It suits my general, my view of philosophy is that it's a branch of biology. That's what I think about philosophy. It's a branch of biology. Just as psychology is and linguistics is. So I think it's a very healthy perspective. It opens up new avenues, you see, new questions, which I think are sometimes easier to deal with than the way we traditionally think about things. So I like your question for that reason.
Okay, thank you. I got your point. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I like when you say I got your point. That's also a good thing to say. So.
Yes. Antonio, do you have questions?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for
this
fantastic opportunity to discuss all these questions. Really outstanding, very unusual for some notions, and to plunge the discussions. I'd say that the danger is for philosophy is to become the branch of biology in this field, not vice versa. So finally, I agree with all your arguments. I like them very much, but it seems to me that the very true idea of your one is not about the argument against something, skepticism or materialism, but it's the idea about perception, and that's where we find the very hard problem and a lot of question. Even if I am the last in the session, so I have a lot to ask. Maybe it's not about are there my perception or not, as I guess I have no others. So the only one that I have already. But the question is, what are they? What property they define for my mind? Because, for example, first, is it about mental case, or is it for mental process? Because if we see Cartesian work there, so we find out that we are cogito in process. So it's not something one finished, already fragmented, etc., etc. Other question is about the complexity of the perception. Is it really this, for example, maybe it is a very clear one perception of pain, but we have no other coming with the pain. And maybe the third and the fourth, could I lie about my perception? Could I mistake? Could I be mistaken about my perception? Because I have no reference inside the perception. So you wrote that I'm cutting off even from the fact of my body, of perception itself, etc., etc. I have no idea, and I have no perception of my unconsciousness, and etc. I do not take the question about introspection and physical world, so it's even out of this asking. But I have no memory of my perception. I have the only one very simple perception that, and I have no others. And I cannot be wrong with this perception. Unconsciously or consciously, I cannot lie. So finally, could we have, after all these issues of your arguments, a picture of a very simple, we'd say animalistic, but I don't know if we can do it, of a very simple cut off from history of perception, cut off modifying the opportunity to modify the perception, very simple perceptual mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're raising a big question there, about the nature of perception. Of course, there's a philosophical approach to it, then there's a psychological approach, then there's a neurophysiological approach. You raised the question of two questions that I could see there. One was about process, and one was about error. So I would say that let's divide the process question into two parts. The first part, is perception a process? Yes. Are there perceptual states? Yes, but perception is a process, and it's a transition from one perceptual state to another. That's what it is. It's not a static thing. It's an active thing. J.J. Gibson, the psychologist, emphasized that point a lot about perception. More relevant to what I was discussing, there'd be the question, well, what implications does that have for the possibility of perceiving perceptions? So if I were to perceive your perception, suppose you have a perception of a red thing, something red, and I consider the question, could I have a perception of your perception of seeing something red? And does it matter whether your perception is a process or not? Well, then the question is, can I perceive processes if it's a process? And I think the answer to that is yes. So in other words, I can perceive objects, the cup, I can perceive states of objects or properties of objects, and I can perceive processes that objects are involved in. I think all those things are true. So process, yeah, I think it applies to it. Possibility of error about perception. Of course, there are two questions there. Is it possible to make perceptual errors? For sure. Perceptual illusions, lots of them. Is it possible to make errors about what it seems to you that you're perceiving? Perhaps that's what you were wanting to focus on. What it seems to you. So I'm looking at the Muller-Lyer illusion, the one I mean, the arrows, right? The Muller-Lyer illusion, they look to be at unequal length, but they're really equal length. I'm under an illusion about the length of the arrows. I think they're unequal when in fact they're equal. Can I be under an illusion about whether it looks to me that they're unequal? I say no. I can't be under an illusion about that. If it looks to me that they're unequal, and I believe that it looks to me that way, my belief has to be true. I couldn't be wrong about that. That goes back to what I was saying early on, and I'm a bit of a Cartesian about this with qualifications, because of the time point that I brought up. But basically, I think I'm infallible about how things seem to me currently. If it seems to me I'm talking to somebody now, then it seems to me that I'm talking to somebody now. Of course, I could be wrong that I'm talking to somebody. I might be dreaming this whole thing, but I couldn't be wrong that it seems to me. Even if I'm dreaming it, it still seems to me I'm talking to somebody.
We are all dreaming then.
Right, so we could all be dreaming, and as I say, I take skepticism very seriously and think it's very hard to answer it. Yeah, that's that. I think does that answer the question as you intended your questions, or not just the way I interpreted them? Is that how you meant the questions?
Yeah. Of course. Thank you so much, and maybe disappointed a lot because I'd like to hear that we can modify, for example, our perception. And
well, I think you've raised a point about memory and the connection between memory
and the memory.
Also good. It's also an interesting and large subject. I've also written several papers about memory.
Yes.
This is something. Ever since I wrote all these papers, whenever I talk to anybody, I always say, and it sounds terrible, yes, I've written several papers about such and such, but I have, because I've written 300 papers on every subject I can think of. So I've written some on memory and some on perception. And And yes, memory can certainly influence the content of perception. That must be the case. There's a question about whether memory is a form of perception. So if I have a memory now, am I perceiving the past when I have a memory of the past? Yeah, lots of things to be said about that. It's a good subject, memory, and rather neglected by philosophers of mind, but I think it's a very interesting subject. And memory and perception, seems more of a psychological subject to me, but still a perfectly interesting subject. I do think one of the things I do think about perception is that it's extremely widespread in the animal kingdom, and that human perception is not very different from animal perception and is evolved from it. So I think human eyes are really not that different from the eyes of fish in the wider scheme of things, because of the evolution of visual perception has a particular character, because obviously evolution discovered eyes very early on in the process, because for obvious reasons. Light contains a lot of information, and if you have a receptor sensitive to that information, it's extremely useful to the organism. So I think that when fish first evolved, the eyes had already been around for a long time and were pretty sophisticated. And so that's why every organism has eyes, and our eyes derive from the eyes of fish ultimately. So they're not that different.
Yes. So, Colin, given that I'm in charge today, I should say from all of us, thank you very much that you have participated in our seminar, and we are really looking forward to seeing you in Moscow next year at our Conference of Philosophy. And
sounds good to me.
Yes, and also, so I just have a regret that first time when we have a seminar on your ideas, on your last book, 55 Provocations, you were not here to discuss, because it's great to have you to discuss your ideas. Thank you very much.
Let me make a point about our seminar we just had. It was a very good seminar in the sense that I always approved of when I used to teach seminars a lot. I haven't taught a seminar for 7 years, remember. I used to teach them all the time, of course, for 40 years. I haven't taught a seminar. This is the first one I've taught in 7 years. And whenever I would give seminars, I was often disappointed in them. And I wouldn't tell the students that, but I was not disappointed in this, because here's what we did today, which I think is what seminars should always do. We did not rehash familiar old points that everybody knows, and somebody urging a very familiar point against somebody else's very familiar point and not agreeing for very familiar reasons. That is a waste of time for me. What we did was we actually discussed creative, original points, right? Where we were pushing the subject forward, trying to think of something new to deal with new questions. So I believe partly that's due to me, because of the essays were about original thoughts, but you responded in the right way. You try to respond to my essays, not by repeating old things that you've heard before, and missing the point. And, you actually engaged with what I was trying to say. And so we actually discussed philosophy in a way that was creative. What more do you want, right? That's what it should be like, but it often isn't.
Okay.
That way it was good.
So thank you very much again, and thank you very much to all of you guys that you have been here for 2 hours. It was very fruitful, and
thank you.
Yeah, have a good evening and have a good day, Colin.
Okay, I'm going to go and play tennis, I hope.
Yeah, nice.
That's my plan. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Colin.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Hope to see you.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.